It was a chilly October evening, and the town of Hillridge was alive with excitement. The annual Halloween Ball was the most anticipated event of the year, held in an old mansion that sat on the outskirts of town, shrouded in rumors and mystery. Some said the mansion was haunted, others claimed it was cursed. But to a group of teenagers eager for a night of fun and mischief, it was the perfect spot for a Halloween party. Emily, a quiet and reserved girl, wasn't planning on attending the ball. She had never been one for parties, especially ones held in eerie locations. But when her best friend Sarah handed her an ornate black envelope, sealed with crimson wax, Emily felt a strange compulsion to go. The invitation inside was handwritten, inviting her to the Halloween Ball of the Century at the Wexford Mansion. Despite the ominous tone, Sarah's enthusiasm was contagious, and soon enough, Emily found herself agreeing to go, even though every instinct told her otherwise. The night of the party, Emily dressed as a ghost, wrapping herself in layers of white fabric. It was a simple costume, but it seemed appropriate for the event. Sarah, on the other hand, had gone all out, transforming herself into a dark, glamorous witch with smoky eyes and a flowing black gown. The two girls met up with a few friends, and together, they drove toward the mansion, the full moon casting long shadows across the deserted road. As they approached Wexford Mansion, Emily's unease grew. The mansion loomed over them, its dark windows like empty eyes staring down from its decaying facade. It was far more dilapidated than she had imagined, and yet, the glowing orange lights from inside gave it a strange allure, like a beacon calling them into the unknown. They entered through the grand front doors, greeted by eerie music and the sight of dozens of partygoers in elaborate costumes. The ballroom was enormous, with high ceilings draped in cobwebs and chandeliers dimly flickering as if struggling to stay lit. Skeletons, vampires, and witches danced under the haunting glow, but there was something off. Emily couldn't quite place it, but a chill ran down her spine. "Isn't this amazing?" Sarah squealed, pulling Emily toward the dance floor. "It's like something out of a movie." Emily nodded, but her eyes wandered around the room. There was something about the guests, their movements too smooth, too graceful. She couldn't shake the feeling that some of them weren't entirely human. They danced for a while, the music echoing through the hall, when Emily noticed a man standing by the staircase, dressed in a black suit with a pale face, almost ghostly. His eyes seemed to lock onto hers, and for a moment, she felt like she couldn't breathe. His gaze was piercing, unblinking, as though he could see into her very soul. Suddenly, the room felt colder. Emily's breath fogged in the air, and she realized the temperature had dropped drastically. She turned to Sarah to mention it, but her friend was gone, swallowed by the crowd of dancing figures. Panic surged through her chest. She pushed her way through the sea of costumes, trying to find anyone familiar, but the faces around her seemed to shift and blur. The music slowed, becoming distorted and hollow. "Sarah?" Emily called, her voice trembling. No response. She felt a hand on her shoulder and spun around, only to come face to face with the man from the staircase. His eyes were unnaturally black, like voids, and his skin was so pale it looked like it had never seen sunlight. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice low and raspy. Before Emily could react, the lights flickered, and when they came back on, he was gone. The music resumed, lively and upbeat, but the feeling of dread remained. Emily's heart raced. She had to find Sarah and leave, now. Something was terribly wrong with this party, and she wasn't about to stick around to find out what. As she made her way toward the entrance, the doors slammed shut with a deafening bang. Emily froze at the sound of the doors slamming shut, her heart thudding in her chest. The grand entrance, which had been wide open and welcoming just moments ago, was now sealed tight. Panic clawed at her throat, but she fought to stay calm. She couldn't afford to lose her head, not now. "Sarah," she called out again, her voice barely audible over the swelling music. She pushed through the crowd of dancers, their faces hidden behind intricate masks, their laughter echoing in unsettling harmony with the haunting melody. But no matter where she turned, Sarah was nowhere to be found. As Emily wandered deeper into the ballroom, the air felt thicker, almost oppressive. The chandeliers above flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. The dancers moved in strange patterns, their motions too fluid, too synchronized, as if they were performing some kind of ritual. Emily's skin prickled with unease. Suddenly, she spotted her friend Chloe standing by the edge of the room, her fairy wings glittering under the dim light. Relief washed over Emily, and she hurried toward her. "Chloe!" Emily gasped, grabbing her friend's arm. "Have you seen Sarah? We need to leave. Something's wrong with this place." Chloe turned slowly, her face pale, eyes wide with a vacant, almost hypnotized look. "It's just a party, Em," she said in a flat, mechanical tone. "Relax and enjoy it." Emily stared at her in disbelief. Chloe wasn't acting like herself. Her usually vibrant and sarcastic friend seemed hollow. It was as if the energy had been drained from her, leaving behind a shell of who she used to be. A wave of nausea rolled over Emily. She took a step back, her hand still clutching Chloe's arm. "Chloe, we need to get out of here. Now." But Chloe's eyes drifted away from Emily, focusing on the dancers in the center of the room. "The music," she murmured. "It's so beautiful, isn't it?" Before Emily could respond, Chloe broke free from her grasp and glided toward the dance floor, disappearing into the crowd. Emily's pulse quickened, fear gripping her more tightly with each passing second. Something was horribly wrong with this place, and now she was sure of it. The guests weren't just acting strange, they weren't acting human. The lights flickered again, this time plunging the room into darkness for a moment that stretched on too long. The music warped, slowing to an eerie wail that sent shivers down her spine. When the lights came back on, the ballroom had changed. The grand space felt smaller, the walls closer. The faces of the partygoers seemed distorted, twisted into grotesque masks, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. And the man from the staircase, he was there again, standing by the far wall, his eyes still locked on Emily. Her breath hitched. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but the room felt like a trap, as if the very walls were closing in on her. She backed away slowly, searching for any exit, any way out. That's when she noticed something that chilled her to the bone. Some of the guests weren't dancing anymore. They were standing perfectly still, staring directly at her. Their expressions were blank, but their eyes glowed faintly, watching her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. It was as if they were waiting for something, waiting for her to make a move. Emily's legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to turn and move toward the side door she'd seen earlier. She didn't care where it led, as long as it was away from the ballroom. She kept her head low, avoiding the gazes of the lifeless figures around her, praying they wouldn't follow. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a dark, narrow hallway that stretched into the shadows. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside, the door closing behind her with a soft click. The sound of the music and laughter faded, replaced by the oppressive silence of the corridor. The air was damp, smelling faintly of mildew and decay. She could hear her own breathing, shallow and rapid, as she moved forward cautiously. The hallway seemed endless, the dim light barely illuminating the cracked wallpaper and peeling paint on the walls. Emily felt a growing sense of dread with every step, as though something was lurking just beyond the edge of the light, watching her. Suddenly, there was a soft rustling sound behind her. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She slowly turned her head, but the hallway behind her was empty, or so it seemed. The rustling came again, this time closer, followed by a faint whisper. "Emily." Her blood turned to ice. She hadn't told anyone at the party her name. The voice, low and hollow, echoed down the corridor, sending a wave of terror through her. She bolted, sprinting down the hallway, her footsteps echoing loudly against the old wooden floor. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, chasing her as she ran. "Emily, come back." She didn't look back. She couldn't. All she could do was run faster, her heart pounding in her ears, the darkness seeming to close in around her. Finally, she reached the end of the hallway, bursting through another door and into a small, musty room. She slammed the door shut behind her and pressed her back against it, gasping for breath. For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, the whispers began again. Emily stood with her back pressed against the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The room she had stumbled into was small and suffocating, lit by a single flickering bulb that cast eerie shadows across the peeling wallpaper. The silence weighed heavily on her, broken only by the faint whispers that seemed to seep through the cracks in the door. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the night, Sarah's disappearance, Chloe's blank stare, the man with the void-like eyes. The party had transformed from strange to terrifying in a matter of minutes, and now she was trapped in a house filled with something far worse than costumed partygoers. Whatever those things were, they weren't human. Not anymore. The whispers outside grew louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices calling her name. Emily knew she couldn't stay in the room forever. She had to find a way out of this nightmare before it was too late. But as she looked around, her hope began to wither. There were no windows, no other doors, no visible escape route. Just four crumbling walls and the creeping sensation that she wasn't alone. A creak echoed from the far corner of the room, and Emily's heart nearly stopped. Slowly, she turned her head, eyes straining in the dim light. At first, she saw nothing but shadows. Then, out of the darkness, something moved. A figure. It was hunched over, crouched in the corner, its back turned to her. The figure's outline was vague, but Emily could see it was dressed in an old-fashioned gown, the fabric torn and stained. The air in the room grew colder, so cold that she could see her breath in the air. She froze, praying it hadn't noticed her, though she had the sickening feeling it knew she was there. Her heart pounded in her chest as the figure slowly began to rise. It stood to its full height, unnaturally tall, its back still to her. Emily wanted to scream, wanted to run, but her body refused to move, paralyzed by fear. The figure's head twitched, like it was about to turn toward her, but it stopped. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, it began to glide toward the far wall. Emily's stomach churned. The figure wasn't walking, it was floating just inches above the ground, its feet never touching the floor. She watched, horrified, as it moved to a door she hadn't noticed before, hidden behind layers of tattered wallpaper. The figure's hand, pale and skeletal, reached out and gently pushed the door open. For a moment, it paused in the doorway, as if waiting for something. Then, without a sound, it disappeared into the darkness beyond. Emily stood frozen, her mind reeling. The figure hadn't harmed her, but the fear that clung to her skin was undeniable. Was it leading her somewhere? Was it a trap? Every part of her wanted to stay where she was, to hide in the relative safety of the small room. But the suffocating whispers on the other side of the door urged her forward. The new door, the one the figure had revealed, beckoned. Maybe it was her only chance to escape. With shaking hands, Emily moved toward it, her legs heavy with dread. The door creaked as she pushed it open wider, revealing a steep staircase leading down into what looked like the basement. Cold, damp air wafted up from below, carrying with it the scent of mold and something else, something metallic and foul. She hesitated, gripping the doorframe until her knuckles turned white. "I can't go down there," she whispered to herself. But the soft creak of the floorboards behind her, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, left her no choice. Emily stepped onto the staircase, the old wood groaning under her weight. She descended slowly, each step taking her deeper into the blackness below. The further down she went, the darker it became, until the faint light from the room above was little more than a memory. The stairs seemed to spiral endlessly, her sense of direction slipping away as she ventured deeper into the mansion's bowels. Finally, her foot hit solid ground. The air down here was thick, oppressive, as if the walls were closing in around her. She squinted into the darkness, trying to make out her surroundings. Her eyes adjusted slowly, revealing what appeared to be a large, circular chamber. The stone walls were covered in strange, ancient-looking symbols, and the center of the room was dominated by a long, wooden table. Laid across the table were masks, intricate, hand-carved masks that looked eerily familiar. Emily's stomach twisted as she recognized some of them. They were the same masks worn by the guests at the party upstairs. But these masks weren't just costumes. They looked far too real, like they had been crafted from something alive. She took a step closer, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch one. The mask was cold, unnaturally so, and as her fingers brushed its surface, she recoiled. The mask felt like skin, stretched and dried, but unmistakably human. A low growl rumbled from the far corner of the room, breaking the heavy silence. Emily whipped around, her eyes wide with terror. In the shadows, something stirred. Something large. It moved slowly at first, crawling across the stone floor with deliberate slowness, as if savoring the moment. Her breath caught in her throat. Whatever it was coming for her. Emily backed away, her mind screaming at her to run, but her feet remained rooted to the spot. The creature emerged from the shadows, a grotesque, twisted figure with too many limbs and glowing red eyes that fixed on her with hunger. Its mouth split into a wide, unnatural grin, revealing rows of sharp, glistening teeth. The mask in her hand slipped from her fingers, shattering the silence as it hit the floor. The creature lunged. Emily turned and bolted for the staircase, her legs pumping as fast as they could. The growls grew louder, closer, the sound of claws scraping against stone sending a wave of pure terror through her. She scrambled up the steps, the wooden stairs creaking and shaking beneath her weight. The darkness seemed to press in on her, the cold air stealing the breath from her lungs. Just as she reached the top, a cold hand grabbed her ankle. She screamed. Emily stood frozen, her body heavy with dread as her mind tried to make sense of what was happening around her. The walls seemed to close in, pulsating like the rhythmic beating of some unseen heart. A grotesque whisper lingered in the air, reverberating off the cracked wood and cobblestones. It was like the house itself was breathing, alive in ways that defied her understanding. And yet, that was just the beginning. She turned to her friends, or what was left of them. Kyle, who had always been the loudest, now stood in a grotesque silence. His eyes, once vibrant and full of life, were dark pits, his mouth twisted into a sneer as if controlled by invisible strings. He stood unnaturally still, a marionette without a puppeteer, and yet Emily could feel the malevolent presence behind him, something far older than she could comprehend, using him as its vessel. "I don't think we're alone," whispered Taylor, her voice quaking as she backed away from Kyle, her face drained of color. But that was the wrong assumption. They were never alone. Not here. Emily's gaze flicked toward the other guests, the partygoers who'd seen human moments before. One by one, they shed their carefully crafted disguises, revealing what lay beneath. They were creatures from beyond this world, horrific beings with faces that rippled like water, mouths where eyes should be, limbs twisted into impossible shapes. They weren't costumes, they were horrors in the flesh. The music from the upstairs party warped, echoing unnaturally. A grotesque melody filled the air, like the symphony of a world beyond death. The laughter was no longer human. It was guttural, animalistic, a cacophony of screams and growls. Emily's heart pounded against her ribcage as her surroundings shifted. The floor beneath her feet seemed to slant, tilting her toward the abyss. She tried to move, to run, but her feet felt anchored to the ground. It was as if the house itself had her in its grip, pulling her towards something far worse than the creatures she could see. Her mind flashed with memories, moments from earlier in the night when everything seemed normal. It was all a lie. This place was a trap, and she was prey. Taylor screamed. Emily whipped her head toward her friend just in time to see her body lifted into the air, her limbs contorting at unnatural angles. The invisible force twisted her, folding her like a rag doll, before slamming her into the floor. Blood pooled around her broken form, her last breath a soft whimper, drowned by the endless noise. Kyle laughed, a laugh that was no longer his. Emily, his voice was low, alien, as if someone else was speaking through him. "You're next." She stumbled backward, fear surging through her veins. The room itself seemed to stretch and shrink simultaneously, distorting into something out of a nightmare. The grotesque beings advanced, their faces no longer resembling anything human. She felt her sanity slipping, like sand through her fingers. Instinctively, Emily bolted toward the stairs leading up to the attic. There was nowhere else to go, no escape, but her body acted on pure survival. She crashed through the door, the wooden steps creaking beneath her weight as she ascended. As she reached the top, the air grew thick with rot. The stench was overpowering, making her gag. The attic was dimly lit by a single bulb that swung from a frayed cord, casting long shadows across the dust-covered floor. There, in the center of the attic, stood a figure. Emily's heart dropped. It was the old man from earlier, the one who had greeted them at the door. Only now, his eyes glowed with a sickly, unnatural light. His skin was stretched too tight over his bones, his mouth twisted into a grin that was far too wide for his face. "You're too late," he rasped. His voice was like dry leaves scraping across pavement. "The house has chosen you." Emily backed away, but her feet slipped on something slick. She glanced down and saw the floor smeared with blood, fresh and sticky. A muffled thumping echoed from the walls, like something monstrous was trying to break through from the other side. The man stepped closer, his limbs bending awkwardly with each step, like a puppet moving in jerky, unnatural motions. "This place," he continued, his voice rising, "is older than you know. It feeds. It takes. And tonight, it will take you." The air felt heavier, pressing down on Emily's chest. Panic bubbled inside her, a frantic need to escape, but there was no way out. Her mind raced, grasping at straws, trying to understand the incomprehensible horror that surrounded her. The house, the creatures, none of it made sense. And yet, here she was, trapped in a nightmare that refused to end. The walls began to tremble, dust raining down from the ceiling. The thumping grew louder, more insistent, as if the house was alive, and something monstrous was crawling within its very structure. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps as she realized the truth. There was no escape. No running. No fighting. The house had already marked her, claimed her as part of whatever twisted ritual it had been conducting for centuries. The man reached for her with long, bony fingers, his grin widening. And then the thumping stopped. For a brief, terrifying moment, everything was still. But Emily knew that was far worse than the noise. The stillness that followed was suffocating. Emily stood in the attic, her mind racing, unsure if she was trapped in a nightmare or some twisted reality. The air hung heavy with the stench of decay, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Or someone. The old man's grin remained etched into his face, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. He didn't need to speak for Emily to understand. She was the house's next victim. The house had chosen her. She could feel it now, coursing through her veins like a dark energy. It was inside her. A sudden crack, sharp and violent, echoed through the walls. Emily flinched, her eyes darting to the corners of the room where the shadows seemed to deepen and writhe. The sound grew louder, splitting the silence like a scream. The walls bulged, like something massive was moving beneath the surface. It was alive. The house was alive. Without warning, the attic floor beneath her feet began to warp and buckle, the wood creaking and groaning as though it were being twisted by an unseen force. Emily stumbled, her hands reaching out to steady herself, but the ground shifted too quickly. The floorboards split apart, revealing dark, pulsing veins beneath the surface, like some grotesque organ exposed to the air. The thumping returned, louder now, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. The old man laughed, a dry, rasping sound that echoed in the confined space. "You feel it, don't you?" he said, stepping closer. His voice was no longer just his own, it was layered, as if multiple voices spoke in unison, each one more ancient and malicious than the last. "The house has waited for you." Emily backed away, her mind screaming for her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The attic was alive, the walls pulsing with something malevolent. She could feel the house's presence pressing in on her, like a predator playing with its prey. In a moment of desperation, she bolted toward the attic window, her only hope of escape. She threw her weight against it, but the glass didn't shatter. Instead, the window seemed to warp, bending inward like a reflection on the surface of water. It rippled beneath her touch, and then solidified again, trapping her in a prison of flesh and bone. Her hands trembled as she looked back at the old man. "What is this place?" she gasped, the words barely escaping her dry throat. "The house is more than just wood and stone," the old man replied, his voice dripping with malice. "It's a gateway. A doorway to places far darker than you can imagine. And it's hungry." As if on cue, the walls of the attic began to pulsate more violently, the veins beneath the floorboards throbbing with life. The ceiling above her rippled, and Emily realized, with growing horror, that the house was not just a structure. It was a living thing, a sentient, malevolent force that had been feeding off the souls of its victims for centuries. It had trapped them all, her, Kyle, Taylor, everyone who had ever set foot inside its walls. And now, it wanted her. She could feel it in the air, a creeping dread that slithered into her mind. The house was alive, and it was inside her head, whispering things that made her blood run cold. Dark thoughts, violent thoughts. It wanted her to submit, to give in to the darkness that was clawing its way into her soul. But Emily wasn't ready to give up. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, she grabbed a nearby wooden beam and swung it at the old man. The beam connected with a sickening thud, and for a brief moment, she thought she had done it. She had fought back. But the old man only staggered, his grin widening even further, his face warping into something inhuman. His skin seemed to stretch and crack, revealing the grotesque, rotting flesh underneath. "You can't fight it," he rasped, his voice echoing through the attic like a chorus of whispers. "You belong to the house now." Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, her eyes darting around the attic for any means of escape. The walls were closing in, warping and twisting as if the house itself was breathing. The floor beneath her feet buckled, sending her sprawling to the ground. And then she felt it, a cold, slimy hand wrapping around her ankle. She screamed, kicking at whatever had grabbed her, but the grip tightened, pulling her down toward the gaping crack in the floor. It was as if the house was trying to swallow her whole, dragging her into the darkness below. Her fingers clawed at the splintered wood, but it was no use. She was being pulled down, deeper and deeper into the heart of the house. The old man watched, his laughter echoing in the confined space. "There's no escaping it, Emily. You're part of it now." With one final scream, Emily was dragged into the abyss. The darkness closed in around her, suffocating and cold. The last thing she saw before the blackness swallowed her whole was the house itself, pulsing with life, feeding on the fear it had created. And then there was nothing. Only silence. Emily stood frozen in the silence. It wasn't peaceful, it was pregnant with menace, a calm before a storm she couldn't yet comprehend. The grotesque figure of the old man, if he could even be called that, watched her, his bony fingers inches from her skin. His eyes gleamed with a malevolent hunger, as if he could already taste her fear. And then the floor beneath her trembled, slowly at first, then with increasing ferocity. The walls seemed to bend and sway, the ancient wood groaning like the bones of a dying giant. A sudden crack echoed through the room, and Emily stumbled as the floorboards began to splinter, opening up to a gaping blackness beneath her feet. She tried to move, but something about the air, the gravity, seemed to hold her in place. It was as if the house was draining her strength, pulling the life from her body. Every breath was a battle. The old man's twisted grin grew wider. "The house has awakened," he hissed, his voice like wind scraping over dead leaves. "You're part of it now, girl." Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse loud in her ears. She looked around desperately, her mind grasping for any way out, but there was nothing. Only darkness below her, the walls closing in, and the old man, his grin widening into something almost inhuman. A shadow moved in the corner of the attic, catching her eye. At first, she thought it was one of the creatures from earlier, come to finish what they'd started. But this was different, darker. It moved with purpose, slipping through the cracks in the walls, weaving through the air like smoke. It was the house. It was alive. Emily could feel it now, in the marrow of her bones. The old man hadn't been lying. It was ancient, older than anything she could comprehend. The house wasn't just a building, it was a predator, a living thing that fed on fear, on souls. And tonight, it had chosen her. As the shadow crept closer, Emily's legs buckled beneath her. She fell to her knees, her hands sinking into the floor, feeling the pulse of the house beneath her fingertips. It was beating like a heart, alive and aware of her terror. "Please," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was begging the house or herself. "Please." But the house didn't care for please. The walls groaned again, and from the black void beneath the floor, something began to rise. Long, skeletal arms, dripping with shadows, reached up toward her. They were cold, colder than death itself, and as they wrapped around her legs, pulling her down into the dark, she screamed. The old man watched with glee, his grin now impossibly wide, stretching across his face like a gash. "No one escapes, girl," he whispered, his voice filled with cruel delight. "The house always takes what it's owed." Emily clawed at the floorboards, her nails scraping against the wood as she was dragged down inch by inch. But it was useless. The more she fought, the harder the house pulled, until the cold fingers of darkness were wrapping around her waist, her chest, her neck. Her scream echoed through the attic, but no one would hear. No one would come. She was already forgotten, swallowed whole by the house's insatiable hunger. And then, with a final pull, Emily was gone. The blackness consumed her, the floorboards snapping shut behind her as if she had never been there at all. The old man let out a low chuckle, his bones cracking as he stood up straight. The house hummed around him, satisfied. Another soul taken, another offering given. For now, it would rest, content with its feast. He looked around the attic one last time, his smile fading into a grim expression. He had seen this play out countless times before, and it always ended the same. The house would sleep, but only for a while. And soon enough, there would be another party. Another group of wide-eyed, foolish young souls, ready to be devoured. The old man turned toward the stairs, his footsteps silent as he disappeared into the shadows. The attic, now empty, was silent again. The bulb above flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, leaving nothing but darkness. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and the house stood silent, waiting. It always waited.